Welcome, everybody, to the Great Relearning. I am Dr. Rob Williams, our host today, and with us in studio, all the way from over the pond, is Jeremy Lent. Jeremy, welcome.
Well, great to be here, Rob. Thanks.
It is really good to have you here, and our Great Relearning team is excited to hear from you, and we'll flow right in. Before we begin, Jeremy, we always like to start at the Great Relearning with just a little bit of breathing together per what you actually write about in your books, and sort of with a nod to integration. So I'd invite you and me and our audience listening and watching to go ahead and just relax for a moment. And if you're sitting and not driving, getting both feet on the floor and closing our eyes and gently sealing up our lips and just bringing our breath into our nose. Just have a few breaths together, setting the stage here for our conversation. And with each exhale, just relaxing the shoulders, quieting the mind, setting our intention for this conversation. Let's take one last breath in together. Go ahead and inhale, 3, 2, 1, and exhale, 3, 2, 1. Letting go of the breath with the mind, coming back into the space, and blinking open the eyes.
Well,
Jeremy,
thank you, Rob,
yes,
for a wonderful way to begin a conversation. Couldn't be better.
Well, thank you. And let me, before we go any further, hold up what are just two remarkable books. This is your first book, The Pattering Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. And your second book, which I have recently discovered in preparation here, is a book called The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. And we're going to do our very best in an hour or so, Jeremy, to unpack both of these remarkable books. Before we begin and dive in, though, I'm wondering, could you talk just for a moment about how you came to research and write these books?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. And well, I guess one thing that somebody might notice is both of those books have the word meaning, either in the title or the subtitle. And really, the way I got to end up writing them was as a result of my own search for meaning, because I went through a sort of crisis point. Sort of, you might consider it a midlife crisis if you want to be reductionist about it, but and the experience of it was this total crashing of everything I'd built around myself in my life. About 15 to 20 years ago, my wife at the time, who passed away, we'd been together ever since I was like 21 years old. So just my only sort of true love partner in my life. She began to get very sick, and I looked after her for a number of years, but she was kind of suffering from kind of borderline dementia. So I really lost the person I was connected with. I'd built a successful internet company, taken it public. I left it to look after her. That collapsed. I left it before it was ready for me to do so. Became part of the dot-com crash. And it's like everything had crashed around me. And as I was sort of noticing all the things I'd built up were no longer there, I made this kind of deep determination that whatever I did in the next step of my life was going to be truly meaningful. But my question was, what is meaning? I didn't want to take somebody's word for it. I wanted to really figure it out for myself. I wanted it to be something that wasn't just something that I got to in some sort of act of faith. I wanted it to really make sense to me from a rational point of view, but equally important, I wanted it to make sense to my heart, to my body, to a sense of a true, all of who I was. And that ended up launching years and years of my own path of both intellectual research and discovering embodied practices like meditation or other things, and led me to ultimately go, it would be great if I was kind of looking for that first book that I wrote, that which is a book about the different ways in which cultures have made meaning out of the universe from earliest times onwards. So I thought, well, as I made my own notes around this, let me write that book, both for my own way of clarifying, but really to offer it to others who might have similar questions.
Well, Jeremy, that's so beautiful. And thank you for sharing that biography. And you lay this out a little bit at the beginning of your second book, The Web of Meaning. You tell a little bit of your personal journey. I have to ask you, I'm trained as a historian. And what you have done in the Patterning Instinct is, I would use the word magisterial. It's really, really impressive. But you did not have any historical training.
Yes, that's right. And in fact, that may have helped.
I was just thinking that, actually. Yeah.
And in fact, both of these books are deeply footnoted. There's almost, it's hard to find a paragraph that doesn't have a footnote, which refers to, usually I try it to be not just one, but more than one academic source buttressing what I have to say about it, which is interesting because in some ways it's like I wanted to make both these books deeply academically and scientifically rigorous. And at the same time, I believe if I'd come through an academic background, I could never have written those books because our whole education system and our whole system of academia basically is designed along the lines of the worldview that I explain and critique in those books. Our dominant worldview is designed to separate things, put them into separate disciplines, and then go deeper and deeper and deeper within that discipline. So if you're in, you'll have to tell me your experience, but from most of the understanding I have, and if you're in history in academia, just as if you're in any scientific branch, your sort of pressure is to specialize and go deep, deep, deep into one area. And then if you want to try to connect up another area, then maybe it's a real bold leap of courage to say, well, I'm a medieval historian, but I'm going to expand out to ancient history, or I'm going to go to more, and even that's considered like a big bold leap. But my books are about real deep integration of all different aspects of knowledge, whether it's history or philosophy, or basically neuroscience or anthropology, all these different areas put together in an integrated whole. And as an academic, that would almost be basically career suicide to make that kind of step, because you just open yourself up to so many different criticisms.
Heresy.
Exactly.
Blasphemy, Jeremy.
As I did it, because I was very aware of the fact that I didn't have that academic background, it almost, I was under this compulsion to make sure that every single step I took, every single statement I made or proposition I made was really deeply researched according to peer-reviewed science, not just maybe some wacky intellectual who comes up with these ideas and oh good, I'm footnoting him. No, but this was peer-reviewed science, because I'm not expecting everybody who reads my books to agree with them, and some people might have their valid disagreements, but I didn't want anybody to feel that they couldn't trust the actual quality, the rigor of what I put out there. And so so that's the story behind that.
Well, I'm a footnote geek. So I was in heaven reading both your books. I always read with two pens in a book, one to make my own notes, and then a pen in the back that tracks the footnotes. With the flow of the narrative. So, well, and just to put a pin in academia, I think it does speak to our current predicament. I would just make two quick observations. One is, yes, I agree with you. The relentless siloing of information into separate categories, separate silos, is a problem. And then the other thing you just touched on is just how reductionist we have deemed higher learning now, with its emphasis on the neocortex and rational thought, and only that which is measurable is true, let's say.
Right.
So it is a problem. It's actually two problems in one. But so we'll put a pin in that. I wondered if you could describe this phrase or this concept of cognitive history, because you
Yes.
frame up your first book, The Patterning Instinct, by saying this is cognitive history. What does that mean?
Yeah. So usually when you put this adjective cognitive in front of some sort of discipline, what you're saying is that as you pursue the discipline, you're going to have a focus on the ways in which the human brain kind of works to actually manifest itself in whatever that discipline is. So if you look at, say, cognitive anthropology, it's like anthropology, but looking at basically how the human brain forms the different ways in which, for example, cave art might develop, or cultures might arise in different areas and different times. So the idea about cognitive history was to look at the way history has unfolded, but through the lens of cognition, which ultimately means understanding that history is not just a matter of stuff that happens, or stuff that happens, say, on account of our geographical or environmental contexts, but is also driven by the ways in which humans, and collectively human society, makes sense of the world around them. And so a big insight that arose from that first book, The Patterning Instinct, was, I sort of summarize it in this kind of simple way, that culture shapes values, and those values shape history. And that actually is quite a radical turn from what has become the sort of dominant way, the dominant progressive way of looking at history, which really, and many people might be familiar with, say, like the work of Jared Diamond, this great book he wrote called Guns, Germs, and Steel, where it was a radical departure in history. It's written now about maybe 20, 30 years ago. And basically what history up until then had been driven mostly by this kind of almost like this sense of European triumphalism, like the sense that was that there's something special about European culture, which is why we got to dominate the world, and let's find what it is that. And it was almost, it was sort of as if it was talking about cultural changes, but there was this deep underlying racist white supremacy sort of concept around it. And Jared Diamond, to his great credit, and others, other colleagues, others around him, began to say, actually, if we look at history from a more geographical perspective, we can find that it's not because there was something unique to European culture that it developed like that. It's actually more around how the geography of Eurasia worked, and looking at how different crops evolved in different ways, looking at how different animals were able to be domesticated, and that's actually what drove the pattern of history. It was a great breakthrough, and I sort of tip my hat to Jared Diamond for doing it in that way. But my book, it doesn't deny what people like Jared Diamond say, but it adds another layer. It says, in addition to that, there's ways in which, as cultures begin to evolve in different ways because of those geographical contexts, they also begin to make sense of the world in a different way. And as they do that, that actually the values that culture then become important to them actually has changed the direction of history, which is crucially important, because then we get to understand that the reason that the West became so dominant, the reason why our dominant worldview today came from the culture of Western Europe, essentially, and the ancient Greeks before then, is not just a matter of, well, Europe happened to be closer to the Americas, so Europe got there first. But there's actually an underlying set of values that the Europeans brought with them that was very different from those in other cultures around the world.
It's so beautifully said. And having taught Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond's book for many years, the subtitle of which is The Fates of Human Societies, or The Fate of Human Societies.
Mhm.
I was thinking quite a bit about his book as I was reading yours, because
Yeah.
I think you're right. Diamond offers sort of a geographical
Mhm.
approach to understanding history, and you're doing the same, but with sort of mental or cognitive geography rather than
Right.
physical geography. And I wondered if you could unpack this idea in the patterning instinct of what you call root metaphors, ROOT, root
Yeah.
metaphors.
Yeah. Well, that idea, I mean, that's kind of fundamental to this
Mm.
sort of little discipline, if you want to call it that, of cognitive history. And it comes primarily from the great research of a cognitive linguist. And again, there's that word cognitive. So it's somebody who's a linguist, but then looks at the way the human brain actually shapes the form of language. And his name is George Lakoff. That's Lakoff. And he was a radical thinker, again, a few decades back, who showed that basically the way in which we think and the way in which language works uses metaphors. We usually think of metaphors as something like in poetry, like, the sun blasts its trumpet in the morning, whatever. No, I mean, and that's right, that is a metaphor. But almost every way in which we conceptualize anything is also a metaphor. So if I'm talking to you about, like an evening I spent with a friend last night, and I said she gave me a warm smile. Well, she didn't actually give me a smile. And it wasn't actually warm. Like the temperature didn't necessarily rise when she smiled. But you know what I mean, because we all have these deep metaphors coming from our embodied scaffolding, if you will, like just the things we learn as we're infants, like what is warm and cold, or near and far, or big and small. And those become the ways in which we conceptualize the world without even thinking about it once the metaphors made sense to us. And so what my book shows is that cultures do the same thing. And when cultures from the earliest times in human history, when they look at just the world, like the stars and nature and everything around them, they form a metaphor to understand the world based, again, on their own lived experience. And that's from that root metaphor. And the reason it's a great metaphor is calling it a root metaphor, because from that come almost like the branches of entailments or implications which affect everything else that the culture sees around them.
Yeah, civilizations are fertilized quite literally by their root metaphors, or they emerge organically, perhaps is a better way to say it, out of their root metaphors. I think at some point in your book you quote that famous aphorism, fish seldom think about the water in which they
That's
swim.
right. That's right.
And so what you're doing here in the patterning instinct is pushing us to think and to feel more deeply into these root metaphors that shape literally how we move, how we flow through the world.
Exactly. And and to your point about, the fish being unaware that they're in water because that's all they know about. We, as humans in a normal culture, are unaware that we look at everything through a particular worldview. We can think of that sort of worldview a little bit like a lens, that in just the same way that if I look at everything through the lens of my eye, but until some scientist begins to show me the retina and all that stuff, I don't realize that actually that is a lens. And in fact, for example, I see everything upside down, but that's what the retina does. But it doesn't make sense to. I mean, I see just what I'm used to seeing, and that is the world. And similarly, our worldview essentially tells us this is how we make sense of the world. And a worldview is not something that is explicit. It's not something that every child at age 5 or 6 gets to be sort of sat down on her uncle's knee, and he says, let me tell you, this is how the world works. We do this, we do that. No, she just learns it through her lived experience, and it becomes like and almost like feels like natural. This is the way the world works. This is how you relate to this or that. These are the core values. This is what you're meant to do in this situation. That's a worldview. And once you begin to realize that our worldview is not the way it is, but it's one lens, it's one way of making sense of the world. It frees us up to begin to realize there's other lenses that might be possible that could allow us to make sense of the world in different ways. And that's really a lot of what I hoped to do in the Patterning Instinct, was just show how different cultures made totally different senses of the world based on the ways in which their culture used those root metaphors.
Beautifully said. It reminded me of Daniel Quinn's phrase in his book Ishmael, mother culture. Mother culture is sort of always kind of whispering in our ear. It's kind of enveloping us in her warm embrace. And back to the fish metaphor, to mix them for a moment, we don't often sort of step back and ask, what's up with mother?
Okay. Yeah.
So Yuval Noah Harari comes up in your book too. Fritjof Capra writes to your the introduction to the Pattering Instinct, which is fantastic. And I've always been intrigued with Harari. He's a very interesting and these days somewhat provocative of a historian. But he describes in his book *Sapiens* the reason why Homo sapiens, we humans, have been the planet's most successful species, let's say, is because we've been able to construct essentially collaborative flexibility around shared stories, or what he calls shared fictions. And you titled the book "The Patterning Instinct." And the word instinct kind of keeps arresting me there. Is this patterning phenomenon, Jeremy, is this something that we humans have evolved our way into? Or where does that come from?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, it is exactly as you describe. It is an instinct because it is something that is evolved in and it's evolved uniquely within the human species, within Homo sapiens. And so what that means basically is that if you, to a certain degree, basically every mammal has a certain patterning instinct within it. You can think of the patterning instinct really as to some degree a function of the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is the part of the brain that kind of puts all the different parts together. So it's the integrative part of the brain. It takes things like our felt senses, our emotions, our memories, and it actually connects it all in a way that no other part of the brain is connected to allow certain patterns to emerge. So every mammal has that to some degree, but humans and our the ancestors of Homo sapiens, the hominid ancestors, over millions of years, as we found ourselves in the savannah, separated from the forest, we lived in a much more dangerous and a much more changeable environment. And what was interesting is that we developed more and more sophisticated prefrontal cortex, primarily for social complexity. This is kind of interesting because it didn't develop in order for us to understand the world in a better way. It developed for us to actually understand each other in a better way and develop really complex societies. But as a side product of that, it enabled us to actually conceive of things in a more, using what's called our conceptual consciousness, like a symbolic consciousness. And that's the part of our brain that does this patterning. So the reason we can call it an instinct, and we can see that, is that when an infant's born, one of the first things their brains do, and this has been, again, shown by neuroscientists studying this, is they begin to put patterns into the sounds around them. And nobody tells that brand new little infant, like, now I want you to really work hard on trying to figure out this language, because language is really important. Of course, that doesn't happen. Instinctively, she hears sounds, she relates it to touch, she relates it to her own experiences. And as the months and then years go on, she begins to develop the ability through instinct to understand her own culture's language. And then as is going on in years, obviously, then begins to develop an understanding of her own culture itself and how she or he can become part of that culture. So that's why we can really understand it as an instinct. And I do think that Harari's conceptions and mine align quite closely. The only one significant difference I'd have from Harari is, well, he calls them fictions, which is a kind of a great way to get people to sort of wake up a little bit. Oh, wow, I can't believe we construct everything based on something that's not even true. I had a little trouble with the notion of fiction because I view it more as a lens, because it's not like the thing is not true, but when we recognize we see things through lenses, we can recognize that actually we may be able to actually develop a deeper and a more sophisticated understanding of what is true by looking at different lenses. In just the same way that if I'm taking a picture of a scene in a field or whatever, and I'm using a camera on a tripod, and I take a picture of it. It's not a fiction. It's a particular view of that reality from one perspective. But if I have another camera to the side and I take another picture, I might see something very different. And of course, if I put them together, I might be able to get a three-dimensional, a much deeper understanding of the reality than if I just looked at it through one lens.
Beautiful. So would you say then that instinct in some ways trumps both reason and emotion, or are those three related? Because we hear a lot about sort of the tussle between reason, the rational on one hand, and emotional, the feeling on the other, and we'll go deep into maybe dualism and Neo-Confucianism in a minute. But how do you think of the relationship between instinct, that's patterning, and reason and emotion?
Yes, well, I think we can understand instinct as certain evolved behaviors that any particular species might have, which, because they've evolved, are adaptive to that particular species within the context in which they evolved. Feelings or emotions are deeply related to instinct, in the sense that there's ways in which mammals, including humans, evolved to make sense of the world and to react in appropriate ways. Reason is something that really was as a manifestation of this more developed patterning instinct that humans evolved versus other mammals. And in my books, I feel like the best way to make sense of those distinctions is to look at them as really kind of two different forms of intelligence, or two different forms of consciousness that I label animate intelligence and conceptual intelligence, or and similarly, there's an animate consciousness and a conceptual consciousness. And the reason I think that's important to understand is, first, it's very consistent with the leading theories of neuroscience. Some of the greatest neuroscience researchers in this area, people like Antonio Damasio and others, have all, in many ways, they come to the same understanding that there's what they might call a primary and secondary consciousness. But there's two different forms of consciousness. The what I call conceptual is the one that is more uniquely human, and the other one, animate consciousness, is what we share with other animals around us. So feelings are a core element within animate consciousness. There's other elements within animate consciousness, just what we do actually even below our level of awareness, like homeostasis, the ways in which our bodies work, the ways in which we can react instinctively to things. There's a whole array of animate consciousness. It's important to recognize that that is something that we share with the rest of life, because it almost becomes a bridge for us to recognize our connectivity with all of life. And our conceptual consciousness, this is what's so fascinating, is that in the Western mode of thinking, following from Descartes onwards, we tend to think that conceptual consciousness is the only form of consciousness. And the conceptual intelligence, that thinking, reasoning, logical, symbolic, that uses language, is the only form of intelligence. And Descartes started that by saying, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, as if like existence itself can only arise from that thinking capacity. And that, I think, is a major form of the disconnects and what ends up being like imbalance and pathologies within our dominant culture, coming from that split. That is almost as if saying animate consciousness, animate intelligence has no existence, has no validity or intrinsic existence of its own.
Mm. Yeah, and as I was reading about animate consciousness, of course, my mind drifted into the concept of animism, and every living thing being imbued with some kind of a life force, some kind of a spiritual, in the sense of sort of both respiratory and perhaps supernatural, spiritual force. And this, back to the university for just a moment, it does seem that our universities these days are very top heavy with regard to conceptual consciousness versus the animate. And that's maybe a topic for a separate podcast, but it did get me thinking. Can you take us back thousands of years, as you do in the Patterning Instinct? And you just mentioned Descartes. Can you sketch out what you really see to be kind of the primary difference between, let's say, for simplicity's sake, the West and the East with regard to the patterning instinct?
Yeah, and in a way, that is the like a major theme that goes through that book, The Patterning Instinct, because it's really one of the great shifts in history. Is that split between the East and West that you refer to. And we can see it, I really think it began about around 500 years BCE, before the Christian era, with the rise of the ancient Greeks in Europe, and with the first beginnings of what we now think of as sort of traditional Chinese culture, with like Taoism and Confucianism in China. And of course, those are manifestations of even deeper layers below that. But we don't need to go too deep into the roots in that respect. But what we see in those two sort of core cultural complexes is very different ways of making sense of the universe. And I've talked a little bit about this Cartesian, this sort of I think, therefore I am. What was ironic about Descartes is that he thought, as he was trying to build his philosophy, that he was shedding all preconceptions. And he wanted to really like say, okay, I want to start from the very beginning. I'm going to get rid of all historical baggage and really try to find reality as it is. And the irony is he didn't realize that he was looking at everything still through the same lens of his worldview. So what he thought was foundational was actually just a restatement of what had been sort of explored basically 2,000 years earlier by the ancient Greeks. And really, we can see Plato as the most important voice that set this dualistic way of making sense of the universe going in the West. And what Plato did is he came up with this concept of basically a split universe, a universe where you had a material world and you had a different domain of perfection. And in that different perfect domain, everything was fixed. Everything was eternal, and everything was sort of sacred. That's where sort of divinity existed in the universe. And the real world, the material world, was like this kind of sort of sad attempt to be some sort of manifestation in physical terms of this perfect world. And by nature, by definition, it was imperfect. In fact, it was corrupted, and it didn't work as well. And the whole notion was to try to get back to that perfection of the good, the ultimate good of that divinity. And along with that split world, Plato saw a split human, where we had our minds, that reasoning, that conceptual consciousness was what linked us to divinity. So it was through reason that our soul was able to connect with that eternal understanding. And that's where things like mathematics was this perfection, always eternally true. But that reasoning mind was housed in this kind of polluted body. And the body was the part that was corrupt and was going to die. And when we died, our soul was liberated to go back to that domain of perfection. So this was this dualistic split that basically Christianity inherited, and then added this notion of God, really just as a trapping around Plato's original ideas. But in the East, in Chinese thought, which then really transmuted to Japanese culture as we know it today, or Korean culture. So it's like ended up becoming all of East Asian culture. It's a totally different way of making sense of the universe. And there, rather than seeing divinity as being in some separate domain, they basically saw it as within everything around them. And they called this sense of the way the universe manifests in the world, they called it the Tao, which really just translates as like a path or the way. So it was almost like saying like the universe shows itself, it manifests in the world in this way. And the path of the human being, the sort of sage or whatever, was not to try to separate his mind from the body and leave it all behind, but to actually harmonize with that way. To actually recognize that human beings were not, they weren't like unique because of their divinity. They were unique in the sense that they were able to kind of connect the earth with the heavens. And they were, in fact, the Chinese graphic for a human being is basically the earth and the heavens in one integrated whole. That's what they understood a human being to be, which led to a very different way of relating to society, of relating to what existence is, and relating to how to act on society, how to act on the living earth.
Neo-Confucianism. Neo meaning new. Our great relearning community is very taken, I think, with this emergence of Neo-Confucianism. Can you say just a few words about that?
Yes, that was a kind of major discovery that I made as I was doing my own research, was this school of thought that arose in China about 1,000 years ago during what's known as the Song Dynasty. And Western historians call them Neo-Confucians because they really took the ancient Confucian ideas from about 500, 400 years BC, and they updated those ideas to some degree. And they called themselves actually the School of the Tao, because they thought of themselves as basically taking these ideas of the Tao and also bringing them more into their sense of their modern world about 1,000 years ago. But what's fascinating about this school, well, there's a couple of things that are fascinating about this school of sages that went on for generations. It wasn't just one moment in time. But one thing that's so interesting is that they ended up actually integrating 3 different schools of different thought. One was Taoism, which really was focusing on just kind of harmonizing with the way, like I described. One was Confucianism, which was much more focused on social harmony and making sense of humans acting together. But the third was Buddhism, which had originated in India, but really found its home actually in China, and had become a maybe almost the dominant way of thinking about spiritual matters or understanding the world around that time. And the Neo-Confucians, ironically, developed their school in reaction to Buddhism. They were trying to refute Buddhism and come back with their own sense of a sort of more Confucian way of making sense of things. But because Buddhism was so much part of the way of thinking at that time, they ended up integrating some of the profoundest Buddhist ideas into their own way of thinking. And the reason why this has in significance to us now, 1,000 years later, is because the way they made sense of the world it was very similar to the kinds of understanding about the universe that modern systems sciences, like complexity science and network science and chaos theory, have also begun to understand the world in the same kind of way. And so this is as I was doing my research, this was one of the biggest sort of light bulbs that went off, because I was reading about modern systems science And you have people like this great complexity theorist, whose name is Stuart Kauffman, who comes from the Santa Fe Institute, like the leading theoretical school of systems thinking, basically pretty much in the world. And he writes books with titles like At Home in the Universe, whatever, because what he understands is looking at complexity science, which looks at really, rather than reductionist science, looking at how things are separate. Complexity science looks at how things are connected up and looks at patterns of organization to understand how they're connected up. And as he was describing these new ways of making sense of the universe through complexity science, I was also reading these Neo-Confucian thinkers from 1,000 years ago, and they had developed an understanding of the universe that rather than it being this separate universe like Plato's concepts, they saw it as being everything in the universe as being basically chi, which translates really like roughly like energy and or matter. You know, like Einstein says, E equals mc squared. We know from science today, energy and matter are really not separate from each other. They're different manifestations of the same kind of force. So similarly, they saw chi as everything in the universe, but the chi had to be connected to each other in different forms. And the ways in which the chi connects up is what determines if some chi is like electricity, or some chi is like air, or some is like rock, or whatever, or some chi is like human beings. And so the patterns of organization are critical. They called the word they used for patterns of organization was Li. And so they understood the world as being comprised, the universe, of chi connected by Li, these patterns of organization. And similarly, here's Stuart Kauffman and other people looking at those patterns of organization in complexity science and saying, this is actually how the world really works. This is how life works, and through these patterns. So the reason why that is so critically important is because then we get to see that it's as if the wisdom that these Neo-Confucian sages developed when they looked at the world through this lens of Li and Qi could actually be applied to our understanding of the world as it is based on our modern scientific interpretation. So it's as if we can show these almost like a Rosetta Stone, like different ways of making sense of things can all of a sudden become more coherent together.
So beautiful. And one of my favorite elements of the Pattern Instinct is how you bring Neo-Confucianism up into the present with chaos theory, and it's so fascinating. Could you just say a word about my favorite concept from this part of the book, Wu Wei? This idea of effortless effort. I just love, and it reminded me of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow, which some
That's
of
right.
our audience may be familiar with. But what is Wu Wei?
So Wu Wei is basically a fundamental Taoist concept. And so as you'll recall, I talked about how in original Chinese Taoist ideas, they looked at the universe as the way in which the Tao manifests itself. And what they got to see was that all other animals and life around them seem to be in harmony with the universe in their particular ways, the ways trees grow, or the way birds fly, or whatever it might be. And they call that Wu Wei, which basically translates as sort of non-purposive action. So it doesn't necessarily, some people will translate it as inaction or no action, but that's really not the correct way of understanding it. It's more like action that is not goal-oriented, that just goes with the flow of whatever it is that's happening. And what they saw is that humans had lost some of that. We sort of go against the flow. And they had a term for that, which is like the opposite of Wu Wei, which is Yu Wei, which basically meant purposive action, goal-oriented action. And the insightful listener to this conversation might go back to, oh, isn't that like that prefrontal cortex, like that symbolic way in which humans act, going sort of against that animate consciousness? And the Taoist kind of understood that. They didn't have neuroscience terminology for that, but that's basically was their theory of civilization, was that humans, as they developed Yu-Wei, which now from a neuroscience context, we might call that more advanced prefrontal cortex. They said humans went against the flow of things. And that's how language developed and civilization developed. And we kind of lost that connectivity with deep nature. And the Taoists saw the path of the sages really trying to shed that Yu-Wei ways of being and thinking and getting much back into the flow. But what I found so fascinating in Neo-Confucian thought is as if they took it to one level further, because because the problem is if you try to shed everything that human conceptual thinking arises, well, you get into problems. First off, you're in sort of battle with yourself because, as I mentioned earlier, each of us as human beings have a patterning instinct. So that leads us naturally to Yu-Wei ways of thinking. So it's a bit of a paradox because our own Wu-Wei as humans leads to Yu-Wei, which goes against the Wu-Wei. So what do we do with that? And similarly with civilization now, like an environmentalist or somebody who really cares about the destruction of our living earth, as I do. But it's very easy to look at that and say, we got to get rid of civilization, just like the Taoists said, get back to when we were hunter-gatherers or whatever. And then a reasonable person might respond, we can't do that. There's 8 billion of us on the earth. Give us a break. Like, what kind of a ridiculous idealism is that? So we get stuck. And what I found fascinating in Neo-Confucian thought, and where I believe we can learn that and apply that into modern ways of relating to these concepts, is this notion of like an integrated consciousness. Rather than saying Wu-Wei is good and Yu-Wei is bad, or in the West, where we said Yu-Wei is good, like our cognitive and conceptual intelligence is good and Wu-Wei is bad, like you can't trust your emotions, whatever. What about if we try to look at ways to integrate those two into a more harmonious whole? And the Neo-Confucians did a great job of that. And they even developed this concept of what they called Chung, which really we can translate as more like integration or deep, authentic integration, which means not sort of excluding one part of who we are as whole creatures, but bringing them all together, which means really when we have feelings, not viewing them as separate from our thinking cognition, but actually looking at how can we sort of connect those up? How can we basically be mindful about our feelings and be embodied in our thoughts and see everything as a collective whole? And I think that is a path that leads to potential great shifts for our society and for ourselves as human beings.
It's such a powerful integrative metaphor, Jeremy, and I'm reminded of mind, body, spirit, or what some call flow, and how we tend to separate out those three in the West. But what you're calling for here, as the Neo-Confucians did, and perhaps the quantums and the chaos theory is calling us to do now, is to really look at integration. And that's a beautiful segue actually to your second book. But before we get there, I wanted to ask you on the Pattering Instinct, just one last question. Could you speak to the emergence? I'm gonna name drop 3 moments in human history and ask you to sort of connect these back to the Patterning Instinct. Agriculture, the Neolithic Revolution.
So really we can see agriculture as one of the great steps of that separation of the human way of living from the rest of non-human nature. So as human beings, we live for 95% of our species history. We were nomadic hunter-gatherers in working together in small bands. And our way of making sense of the world was based on that. And the core metaphor those hunter-gatherers used was really seeing nature more like as a giving parent. and they would just go from flow to flow, a very intimate way of relating with the world. With the rise of agriculture, we developed a sense of separation between humans and non-human nature. We put up fences, and the very word agriculture itself is sort of almost like cultivating the fields. Like we'd cultivate here, wild nature was out there, and it was dangerous and it was scary. And along with that came similar separations within human society. A farmer who got to be lucky or worked a bit harder and ended up gaining more possessions, and those who missed out, rather than sharing with them, they maybe would get employed. They'd be kept out through fences of the field, which would lead to the first time in human history where we got to value things like possessions and hierarchy, and power imbalances between gender and male and female, the rise of patriarchy. All these happened with the rise of agriculture, starting for about 10,000 years ago, but over millennia becoming the dominant force in human experience.
Yeah, some like my old friend Kirkpatrick Sale see the invention of agriculture as, humans' greatest mistake. I'm not sure I'd go that far, but it's yeah. So the patterning instinct and number 2, monotheism. There's been a lot of conversation about,
yes.
what do we make of monotheistic religions, Judaism, and then Christianity, and then Islam?
Yeah.
How does that fit in here?
And so monotheistic religions are so dominant in our world today that it's natural for people to just think, well, isn't that the way in which we make sense of the world? That must be the way it is, because everywhere you look, there's monotheism, and they just differ by the some of the cultural attributes, but everyone seems to agree there's God somewhere, and we got created by God, and God. And what I discovered in this research is that, again, monotheism is a very unusual way of making sense of the world. And it relates strongly to that Platonic separation between that split universe I mentioned earlier, that sense of a perfect eternal universe somewhere, and then the sort of polluted one that spoils in the material world. And in fact, the way in which the sort of Jewish form of monotheism ended up relating to Christianity was through some sort of accidents of history, which I kind of trace in the Patterning Instinct, just some fascinating ways in which the sort of tides of power in the Middle East led some of these ideas of Judaism to be reinterpreted in this new religion of Christianity. And then Islam itself was really a split from that monotheistic way of thinking, forming a different way of making sense of things. But it was really only through conquest, essentially, that Islam went from a small group within the Middle East to Southern Europe and all over Northern Africa and into Asia. And it was then through conquest that Christianity, rather than just being a sort of encapsulated within a small continent of Europe, then became this kind of dominant global religion through the Europeans' form of imperialism and colonialism. So what we think of as the obvious way of making sense of the world really began as a particular dualistic split way of thinking about the universe, which then through conquest has become dominant in the world today.
Yeah, so interesting. One of our community members was asking, is monotheism the greatest single scourge of humanity and in history? And it's like, well,
in fact, and I do have a chapter in the Pattering Instinct saying something like that. Monotheism as the great scourge of history. And what I mean by that is it's not that, in every monotheistic religion, whether it's Christianity, Islam, or Judaism, there are branches within it that actually, even though they're within a monotheistic frame, they absolutely feel into the divinity of all life, deep connectivity, and allow people following those faiths to just develop great spiritual sense of fulfillment, meaning. And so at this point in history, I certainly don't view any of those major religions as being antithetical to what I consider to be the most important spiritual values in the world. And so I just want to make that really clear. But what I think we can look at from a historical point of view, when we look at the dominant ways in which those religions manifested in the world, is that it led to this form of absolutism. Because if you believe that the universe has one God, and that God gave us one set of precepts that we have to follow, whether it's Christian precepts or Jewish precepts or Islamic precepts, then it logically follows that those who don't follow those precepts are bad. They're heretics, and they don't understand the true one way of being. And so you either need to convert them, or you've got to like somehow get them out of the way, because your particular God tells you this is the right way to do it. And what we see in other forms of faith and sense making is a much greater sense of pluralism and diversity, where there's almost any ancient form of religion other than monotheism saw gods as being local to places, and saw different places having spirits and divinities. And if you even ended up conquering another area, rather than say, you know, we're right and we're wrong, oftentimes the conquerors would try to make peace with the local divinity in that area, so that the divine power wouldn't come and act with retribution against them.
Yes, I was recently in Jerusalem, and I was so struck by exactly what you've just described. Every street sign in Israel, Palestine is labeled in 3 different languages: Hebrew and Arabic and English. And it was such an interesting reminder of our attempts to find diversity within the monotheistic tradition, if you will. So
Yeah,
interesting.
so true. And in fact, really, we can think of Jerusalem in many ways as being like ground zero for that absolutism of monotheism, where all 3 of those great monotheistic religions clashed right in that place.
Yeah.
And well, so many people view it as such a sacred place. Personally, when I've visited it, and by the way, by background, I'm Jewish, and as a teenager, I spent time in a kibbutz in Israel and went through this place of like really feeling into the meaning of what that felt like to me. But now, as I go back to Jerusalem, I see it almost as an incubator of that monotheistic intolerance, and I find it very difficult.
Yeah, I felt it was. Yeah, it was very. It was. I felt very conflicted about being there, and you know, to your larger point in the book, and there's whole universes happening outside of those 3 monotheistic traditions, right? And so yeah, well, so let's linger for last one, and then we'll end with your second book, Science and the Pattering Instinct. What do we do with science, Jeremy?
Yeah, well, science is also so fascinating in this context of this kind of arc of history, and because what we think of as science today, the very word itself gets kind of misconstrued in many ways, because science itself is really a way of making sense of the world that again developed in Western Europe around the time about the 17th century with the scientific revolution. And we can think of science as a process of making sense of the world with values attached to it. People think of science as being value free, but actually science itself has values. It has values of transparency, values of honesty, values of when you have an idea, of not just doubling down on that idea, but challenging that idea yourself and empirically testing that idea to see if it makes sense. And you develop a hypothesis using your conceptual consciousness and then test it, etc. That's a set of values around science. But there's a particular form of science that became very successful with the scientific revolution, which often people think that is science. but it's actually a form of science called reductionism, which it was, again, actually pioneered by Descartes, who was the first person to define reductionism. He said, well, if we break everything down into its component parts, and then break those component parts down a little bit more, we can begin to understand them in ways that we could never understand if they were just all mashed together. And that led to all the great breakthroughs, or many of the great breakthroughs of science. It allows you and I to talk to each other now over thousands of miles through the internet, with the development of electricity and all the different amazing, miraculous ways in which we make sense of the world. So science is something, I think, one of the greatest projects of humanity, something the humans can rightfully feel so good about. And at the same time, this reductionist way of making sense of things by breaking them down into little parts was so successful that over generations, people got to believe that reductionism is not just a useful way to understand certain things in a certain way, but is the only way to make sense of the universe, and that any other way to make sense of the universe must therefore be wrong. So leading to another form of this absolutism, a little bit like monotheism, where then you get what I call ontological reductionism. Ontological meaning like really sort of relating to an understanding of existence itself. And so ontological reductionism means somebody who says the universe itself can only be understood by breaking it down into those component parts. Any other way of making sense of it is just wrong and misguided. That, I think, is a fundamental error of our Western mode of thinking. But in recent years, within science, so this is not anti-scientific, but sciences like complexity science, systems sciences, network science, chaos theory, multiple layers of sciences, and looking at the Earth like as a system, Earth system science, all of these say actually the connections between them are just as important, which is where what is so the profound implications of this is that if you look at science just from that reductionist lens, then you see it as being fundamentally contrasted with spirituality, because you can't measure spirituality. You can't like break it down into some little part and say, here's the particle of spirituality. So spirituality goes out the door. It doesn't exist. But once you look at the world from a system science standpoint, you begin to see that breakdown between science and meaning or quality or spiritual understanding is just another conceptualization that we've created. It doesn't actually have real existence.
Yeah, and the subtitle of your second book, The Web of Meaning, is Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. And it seems fitting that we perhaps end our conversation here today with just a few minutes of meditation on your second book. You ask 6 questions in the table of contents. You organize the whole book around 6 questions. Who am I? Where am I? What am I? How should I live? This is my favorite one. Why am I? And where are we going? Why did you write a second book, Jeremy? Pattering Instinct was such a tour de force. Why this book?
Well, thank you. Well, originally, as I was doing this research over many years, I really intended those 2 books to be one book, because we can consider the Pattering Instinct as like a historical diagnostic, if you will, looking at the ways in which cultures have made sense of the universe to the present time. But at the same time, I was beginning to realize that there is a certain different way of making sense of the universe that, per the subtitle of that book, integrates science with traditional wisdom. So obviously the books, as the books enlarged, it became clear that I couldn't fit it all into one book. They're very much, The Web of Meaning is very much a sequel to the Pattering Instinct, because the Pattering Instinct takes us to the present day essentially and looks at our the results of this split worldview, the results of this dominance of reductionist thinking, leading to an imbalance between human civilization and the rest of life on Earth, and the grave the grave implications of where that might lead us in our future. What the web of meaning does is it shows that it's possible to actually look at the world through a integrated worldview, which could, if enough people began to share that way of thinking, actually redirect the human trajectory to a much more harmonious path. And the underlying, the reason I had these questions as the way of structuring the book, just as you read them out, is because the book's organized in that way. And in each of those questions, what the book shows is how the dominant reductionist way of making sense of those questions, of answering those questions, have been shown and are not just dangerous and leading us on this path towards potential catastrophe that we're on right now this century, but are plain wrong from a scientific standpoint. And so in each of those categories, sort of just as we've been hinting at through this entire conversation, I've been showing how the findings of modern systems sciences lead to the same deep insights around our deep interconnectedness within ourselves, with all other people and with all of life, that other spiritual traditions like Buddhism, Neo-Confucianism, Taoism, indigenous wisdom have been pointing to for millennia. And so it weaves these in to show that this split that we make between spiritual traditions here and scientific understanding there are false. And there's a way in which we can integrate them all together into a coherent whole.
Yeah, it feels, your second book, much more personal. Is that, am I
Yes, that
resonating correctly?
That is very true, because that first book is really looking at history, and I don't really have a place in that other than along with everyone else, we're manifestations of all those millennia that came before us. But that second book, it is very much, in a way, my attempt to transmit the way in which I made sense of the universe myself in both an embodied and cognitive, conceptual way. In the 10, 15 years or so of research that I put into it to form these two books. So it felt very much like an opportunity for me to share with others, this is how I personally have come to understand the world. And basically, I really live my life ongoing according to the values that I express in that book. And these are very much life-affirming values, values based on recognition and recognizing that ultimately we are not, each of us is not separate from life, but each of us is life. Each of us is a manifestation of this dynamic, evolving, miraculous force of life that emerged on Earth billions of years ago. And as such, life calls on us to engage with the world in a certain way, to try to maintain and regenerate life's own complexity and richness.
Yes, your book reminded me of Wendell Berry's beautiful essay from 20 years ago called Life is a Miracle, an essay against modern superstition.
Yeah,
and
beautiful.
Wendell Berry's, the modern superstition in question was science. And he was writing in response to Harvard entomologist E.O. Wilson's consilience theory, that science, with a capital S, could be the lens or the root metaphor, let's say, through which all human understanding could be gleaned. And Wendell Berry says, oh no, let's not do that.
Right, exactly.
Let's not do that. I know our time is short. Could you just say something about this concept in your second book of fractal flourishing? I love this idea, fractal flourishing.
Yeah, and that is foundational to a lot of the where the sort of book leads. So, well, these are two big concepts. So let me just kind of unpack each of them just a little bit. So, as you'll remember, as we've talked earlier, both the Neo-Confucian way of thinking and modern system science understood looking at the world in terms of the patterns of connectivity. And when systems thinkers in the last few decades have looked at the world from that sense, what they've found is that a fundamental way in which life itself shows up on the earth is through fractal patterns. And fractal patterns, some people may be aware of what it means, some not. Basically, a fractal is a pattern that repeats itself slightly different ways, but according to the same principles at different scales. And we see fractal patterns basically in all of life around us. If you look at the patterns of trees, the patterns of, say, our bronchioles in our lungs, the patterns of our neural nerve connections, essentially, virtually any, I mean, there are other patterns too in nature, but one of the most fundamental patterns are fractal patterns. And so the thing that we learn from that is that when we look at Earth itself, it's really like one big fractal, which sometimes people use the word a holarchy to refer to that, like a sort of a whole which has the parts within it made of similar principles. So if I, as a human being, have cells within me which organize according to certain principles, and those principles, even though they show themselves in different ways, the same underlying principles form my organs, which form me as an organism, which form my community, which form basically an ecosystem I might be part of, and ultimately the living earth. So that's a sense of fractal. And flourishing is really comes back to the sense of what life really wants. And it's this notion of any organism, and this is a concept that Aristotle did a great job of describing, ironically, because he was a Greek, but actually at odds with Plato. Aristotle, in many ways, was more of a Chinese thinker, according to that distinction I talked about earlier. And Aristotle saw, he called it eudaimonia, the sense that any organism has a purpose in life, and the organism is to, the purpose is to fulfill what it is truly, what it truly was evolved to want to be. And so a tree has a purpose to become a full, flourishing tree. A human has a purpose to be a full, integrated human being. If you put those two concepts together, we get to realize that for each of us as humans to really flourish, it's not a zero-sum game. We can't really flourish at the expense of parts of ourselves within us, so overcome the bad parts within us, whatever. And we can't flourish at the expense of those that we relate to all around us. So rather than the zero-sum game that our dominant worldview tells us it is, like get rich and beat the other person, and everyone, you're either a winner or a loser, and all that stuff, that goes out the window. Fractal flourishing shows us that actually each of us gets to truly flourish when our society is flourishing, when the living earth is flourishing, and when all the different parts within us get to be honored and can flourish too. And that's the path that can lead us to a very, very different future for humanity.
So beautifully said. You begin your second book with the story of Michael Douglas's Gordon Gekko, the Hollywood character who famously or infamously said, "Greed is good." Right. Back in the Oliver Stone's film of the late 80s. And you end, and if you'll indulge me, I love the way you bring the web of meaning to a close, if I may. You write, you're talking about the complex dynamic set of reactions that resonate through the collective consciousness of humanity. And you say there are two crucial implications as you end the book. First, you write, there is a sense of empowerment. However inconsequential our own actions might appear in relation to the massive forces driving our world, we can have faith that their potential resonance extends far beyond what we are able to visualize. And second, there's an awesome responsibility that adheres to the empowerment, the way in which each of us chooses to engage with the world, no matter how insignificant it might seem, matters. With each of the choices we make, the words we speak, the actions we take, we are playing a role in either inhibiting or catalyzing the great transition our society needs if we are to bequeath a flourishing world to future generations. I almost wept when I read that, Jeremy. It was such Such a beautiful way to end the book. And last question for you, because I know time is short. We are the great relearning. What advice would you give to our audience who are interested in bringing these sensibilities? I'm just going to use the phrase fractal flourishing because I love it. What advice would you give us? And maybe you can speak out of your own experience. What are these practices, protocols, values that you can suggest for us as we close here?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think the advice I would give is to engage with these practices, really looking for this potential for deep integration. And so when we do our own personal practices, whether we're engaged in meditation or just trying to become better human beings, whatever that might mean to each of us, that means when we find parts within us that we feel are either parts of our dominant conditioning that we want to overcome, or parts that seem to lead us towards feeling separate rather than connected with people, rather than see those parts as being these kind of bad things that we have to get rid of or overcome or transcend, is actually saying, yeah, this is all parts of me that arose in different ways, to try to fix something, to try to help me, maybe at early times in my life, whatever it might be, and looking at how we can integrate those parts, honor each part, and let them be part of that bigger coherent whole of who we are. And similarly, when we look at others around us who might seem to come from a different set of values, might be we're thinking or acting as enemies of life, or acting as part of this kind of destructive machine we see around us, to then recognize that they themselves have parts within them that want to feel good about life, want to actually feel good about themselves, and look at ways in which we can relate and connect with people on other sides of some political or ideological divide, rather than see them as enemies. And in each part, always to ask this question of, what can I do really for the benefit of all life? And if we keep asking that question and deeply investigating what that means, I feel we can all actually begin to work together to potentially transform the direction our society is going in right now.
So beautifully said. Well, Jeremy Lent, where can people find out more about you and your work, the Patterning Instinct, the Web of Meaning?
Yeah, well, sure. Well, I would offer two different directions to explore. If you're just interested in my work in particular, just go to jeremylent.com on the web, and you'll be able to find out more about those books and other things I'm doing. But I also invite people to check out a network of people from around the world who share these ideas of looking for what we call deep transformation of our society. And if you're interested in that, so just click onto www.deeptransformation.network. And you'll find a great network of thousands of people from around the world connecting around these ideas in ongoing conversations, and live meetings we have, etc., to really explore what's possible to transform our world towards that more integrated and sustainable and flourishing future.
Beautiful. And we'll include both those links in the show notes. Jeremy Lent, appreciate you so much. One last quick question. Are you working on anything new in terms of books?
Actually, yes. I'm working on, really, you can think of it as like the third book of the trilogy, if you will, which is actually looking at this notion of, if we were to live our lives as a collective human species in this way of fractal flourishing, what would our society actually look like? And a number of people from around the world have come up with this term that I have totally adopted. I love an ecological civilization, this vision of what a civilization could look like if, instead of being built on exploitation and extraction and wealth accumulation, if we're actually built on setting the conditions for all people to flourish on a regenerated earth. So my next book is actually to look at what that actually would mean in terms of every aspect of our civilization. whether it's economics or technology or finance or education or law, governance, and seeing like it's possible based on the research people have already done and actions people are already doing in the world right now. It's possible to visualize a totally different kind of civilization that could actually work for everyone to flourish.
Well, amen to that. So be it. Well, Jeremy Lent, we appreciate you so much. Thank you for giving us your time today, and good luck with this new project.
Thank you, Rob, and thanks for great questions and a great conversation. I so enjoyed it, really.
Thank you. Us as well. We'll talk soon.
Bye.
Bye. Welcome to the Great Relearnings Relearning Room. We've got Michael and Ian and Philip Baldwin assembled from around the world to briefly reflect on Jeremy Lent's conversation, his two books, The Patterning Instinct and Web of Meaning, and what that might mean for Homo sapiens, who we are, where we have been, and where we might be going. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you for being here.
So I have to say, I so enjoyed my conversation with Jeremy Lent, and I felt like we could have talked for hours. We kept it to just over 75 minutes. But I'm so curious to hear your reflections. And Michael, if you want to maybe blow us in.
Well, first of all, I thought it was superb. I thought Jeremy was fantastic. I also have to say that I think, Rob, your interviewing is fantastic too. Just great. And I was really pleased that you asked Jeremy how he came to this decision to really dive into meaning in life, because I was so impressed that he took all that suffering that he went through, that huge loss or losses that he went through. And I, of course, think the majority of people, when they are faced with suffering, have a tendency to sort of fall on their swords, whine, cry, throw in the sponge. And then the minority go, wow, suffering. Let's see what we can learn about suffering. And so for Jeremy to take those two major losses and spend 10 to 15 years getting into the meaning of life, so to speak, I just loved it. Now, I think that the three of us decided, or the four of us decided, that Jeremy was the good way to kick off, was a lot to do with the fact that Jeremy covers so many worldviews, particularly the Eastern worldview. And in specifics, what we are all somewhat additionally focused on is this new thing for us called Neo-Confucianism. But, in setting the stage for these podcasts and everything else, he's terribly helpful in making you understand that there are multiple worldviews. It's not just the Western that we're steeped in, and it's not just the Eastern. It's incredible diversity of indigenous people's worldviews, and we need to get a handle around some of this material to understand it. Now, what struck me or strikes me in reading The Patterning Instinct and The Web of Meaning is that so many of these worldviews, philosophies and religion, are very much focused, of course, on kindness and compassion and doing good for others, thoughtfulness, generosity, forgiveness. And of course, from my personal point of view, is you have this plethora of worldviews that urge this kind of behavior. And yet, the bottom line is, as far as I'm concerned, there is this horrendous amount of cruelty. So it seems to me we're trying to understand what exists has existed in the way of worldviews or understanding of the nature of reality. And then there is the behavior thing as a consequence. And I think what we will eventually try to do in these podcasts is get to some of these authors and thinkers to understand what are the causes of this type of appalling behavior throughout the world, throughout most of time. And so that's my little riff. And Jeremy, aided so beautifully by you, Rob, did a fabulous kickoff. That's it, kids.
Thanks, Michael.
I'm happy to speak also, Philip, if you.
No, I'm easy, whatever you like. If you want to go ahead, do so.
As I said, before we sat down, I'm not sure where to kick off. So if you have something you want to say, you should say it, and then maybe I can come up with something.
Well, okay, fine. I think, first of all, once again, Michael, you have done a beautiful job of sending the arrow to the bullseye of the conundrum which we face. And so much of what Jeremy imparts takes aboard all of these strands that feed into our story. And for me as a Westerner, obviously, totally, deeply embedded in my DNA is the whole Western tradition. It is, of course, fantastically enlightening to get ever more deeply engaged with some of the other worldviews, which run so far from our own. And as we've addressed before, the whole Eastern emphasis in very much great measure on the value and importance of the larger community versus the prerogatives of the individual is a driving factor. And the Neo-Confucianist story, which even though I've read it twice and am listening again audially in the car, it takes a while to get through because in fact it's quite alien to our worldview.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, a great deal about it is enormously appealing, enormously, shall I say, more balanced than our particular view and tradition. And of course, once again, you scratch your head and you think about the role of monotheism and its antecedents and predecessors and so on. And you have this great dichotomy, which we've been struggling over for, I guess, thousands of years, if you take the whole planet in the round. And Jeremy does a beautiful job of pointing out all these different points in the constellation. And based on everything I've been able to read and learn up to now, the biggest aha has been this Neo-Confucianist idea, which strikes me as deeply more nuanced and more reasonable somehow than our own. And what can I say? Except obviously expressing great admiration for Jeremy and putting this all together in the same package so eloquently, is how can we bring that aboard? How can we bring aboard some of the deep thinking in Neo-Confucianism that seems to be largely alien to the Western worldview? And of course, the elephant in the room is that the Western worldview has, at least for the moment, taken over the planet. I'm not quite sure what to add further in the context of what we've just been saying.
Other than you're on a boat Philip. So to say that we should bring Neo-Confucianism aboard makes me very happy.
So, nautically oriented people have this
Yes.
habit of expressing a great many things in terms of boats.
Well, and that brings us back to Jeremy's point about root metaphors, doesn't it? Yeah, I love that. I love that. Yeah. Yeah, I just quickly, I too, Philip, was really taken with Jeremy's deep dive into Neo-Confucianism, which I knew a little bit about, but I've sort of flagged it. I put a pin in that just to kind of spend some more time in conversation with Neo-Confucianism because it's so fascinating.
We're going back to is it the Song Dynasty, 9th century?
Correct.
You know, these people were awake.
Yeah. Yeah. While
we were, sending Vikings.
Well, he points out in going to the Song Dynasty and the origins of the Neo-Confucianist movement, which stretches roughly from the 11th to the 14th century. He points out that it's formed as a reaction to Buddhism, which was the dominant Mahayana Buddhism, which was the dominant religious force at the time in China. So it's very interesting that this, what we call Eastern, which is an outmoded way to speak, religion, it integrates three great traditions. Taoism, they called themselves the new Taoists. First, the Neo-Confucianists, and unspoken, here we are, we're superseding for our own civilization Buddhism, but Buddhism isn't really thrown in the trash bucket. It's integrated. And then about monotheism, we all hit on monotheism, but Jeremy made a very sensitive point. I did something I never do, which is I re-listened to the interview. And he made a very sensitive point about monotheism, which was within all those three great traditions are significant movements of people who want to honor the idea of interconnectedness and the mystical, the spiritual, which is the unifier of human beings. And so I tip my hat to him, because having for decades had it out for monotheism as a winding tapes inside my own head, I also recognize, for instance, Paul Kingsnorth, who began life as an environmentalist, is now an Orthodox Christian.
Yeah.
Now we have to ask ourselves, and hopefully the four of us are going to be able to talk about a Paul Kingsnorth interview at some point. Why did he do that? And I think the reason is, and maybe this is something that I'm not entirely sure we got out of Jeremy, but we might have, because Rob had to cover 1,000 pages worth of writing. The key thing is, how do we bring the spiritual back into the material? Does this solve Michael's problem of cruelty? If we can do it in a new way, and perhaps balanced with science, the true science, the kind of science Carlo Rovelli talks about, who was also one of our informants, which is science that doesn't make a religion of itself.
Right.
It has a limited purpose to understand material events, nature. And as soon as it's becomes scientism, claiming open and shut, we got it, we nailed this puppy. This is contra the scientific spirit, which is always about doubt. There is no final statement. So I do think science has to be part of whatever integrated solution we come to. And I didn't get how Jeremy's cluster of sciences that he thinks will be helpful to this process of integration: complexity science, chaos theory, systems science, and so forth, networks. He mentioned network. That's all about how do we relate as human beings and to nature, the rest of nature. I shouldn't say to nature, the rest of nature. How do we do that? Science has a role in that. And that's what's interesting, I think, I think all three of us found the what he calls the Neo-Confucianist thing, is it provides a religious platform that can somehow be integrated with the science platform as described by Rovelli.
Yeah, wow. And Philip, please.
I was just going to say this, the word religious is a slippery slope sort of word, because of course the relationship between spiritual, religion, and institutional is complicated. And so if we look across all of these things, as soon as we get, and that's one of the things that I find so fascinating about Paul Kingsnorth, he's joined not just a spiritual tradition, he's joined a religious tradition, which by definition is institutional, with established rules and regs. And some of that is complicated, at least for me, because my knowledge of these things is not exactly full of fun. And so, as Ian was trying to say about how do we integrate these things, it's so about this issue of balance. Any kind of tradition, you got to have rules and regs, otherwise you can't maintain the tradition. Any kind of spiritual practice, you've got to have rules and regs, or you can't do the deal. All of this stuff has boundaries, rules, regs. And that's what I think part of what we found so fascinating about Neo-Confucianism. It enters into a conversation outside of what we're used to in discussing where these things are situated and balanced. And I'd like to pull out of my hat a perfect example, but I'm not thinking of it right at the moment. Anyway, maybe that got us off the point. I hope not.
Well, I think we've laid a few things on the table in the relearning room.
Yeah.
I'm a historian of words, as I know you all are, and the word religion comes from the Latin religare, which means to bind together. Yes. And even better, the word spirit comes from the Latin spira, which means breath. Yeah. So think about the power of those two words and the metaphorical, back to Lent, the power of and the creative tension between religion, right, as sort of a set of rituals and practices that bind people together, Philip, to your point, and the power of spirit, the spiritual spirits, which is more mysterious. You know, it's sort of this animating force. We're sort of exchanging, you know, breath with one another in real time, of course, every living, breathing thing on the planet. But then there's this kind of collective unconsciousness, which Lent ends the web of meaning by describing. And it's all very mysterious. And we've laid a couple of other authors on the table, Ravelli, Paul Kingsnorth. But maybe we end today by teasing our audience with our next author. We will be discussing next month Mark Booth's The Secret History of the World. So I'm curious as we end, and I'm going to put you all on the spot. I don't know the answer. Why, in a nutshell, why does this book or Booth's work intrigue you? And maybe we'll end there just with a little teaser. Can anybody speak to this? I just finished this, by the way. It's magnificent, very challenging.
Yeah.
Well,
it as Lent in the Pattering Instinct volume, the highlight for us, I think, was that Song Dynasty moment of Buddhist triumph in a culture that had a very ancient tradition, above all in Taoism, but then from the 6th century BC on, Confucianism. In other words, they'd been around for at least 1,000 years, and in the case of Taoism, I suspect a great deal longer. So Booth, from my recollection of reading him, says, now, wait a minute. He doesn't say, now, wait a minute, but in effect, he says, now, wait a minute. The West has these esoteric traditions as well. And we have forgotten about
okay.
Yep.
That's very helpful, Ian. I didn't fully
that was perfect.
grok that context, as Robert Heinlein likes to say, grok. Well, maybe that's a great setup for next month.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Any last words?
Well, this is fun, guys. I appreciate it. I enjoy being with you all, and I reiterate what Michael has said about Rob's weaving us together. It's a masterful effort.
Well, that's kind.
Cranky old fuckers.
Well, that's kind, and maybe that's a good segue. The very end of The Web of Meaning, Jeremy Lent's book, the last section is called New Threads of Meaning, and the question Lent asks, it's the last question in the book, and this maybe we can direct to our audience here as we wrap up. What is the sacred and precious strand that you will weave? So a good question to ponder as we flow into next month. Gentlemen, thank you all for joining us in the Great Relearning Room, and I look forward to our next guest, Mark Booth, The Secret History of the World, and that will be our next episode of the Great Relearning.
Right.
Good.